This is a presentation of a project called Project Mongoose by myself, Emil Safir. If you have questions and you want to contact me, the best way is on Twitter at Emil Safir. If you want to download a copy of the code we'll be discussing, the project, you can go to the GitHub account that I maintain at Emil535. There's a project there called Project Mongoose, and there's also a wiki. So you can get everything you need, and if you have any questions, reach me on Twitter. We're going to be doing our presentation using Swift 3.0 in the development environment of Xcode, which is 8.21. As Einstein famously said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Make it too simple, you're not communicating the essential ideas, and if you don't make it as simple as possible, you're introducing a lot of extraneous things. So this is a very simple project, but it covers a lot of important points. On the right, you can see the user interface that we'll be building and playing with. It's a very simple user interface. There are 3 buttons that are in red. They're labeled dog, cat, and mongoose. When you press one of the 3 buttons, the image of the corresponding animal appears, and the name of the animal appears in the label below it. That's it. That's the whole UI, the whole application. You're not going to make a lot of money with this as an iPhone application. But you can learn a lot about both Swift and Xcode, and that's what we're going to be doing in this project. The topics covered are, we're going to be building a UI which includes a UI image, a label, buttons, and stack views. So those are the elements that we'll be working with. We're going to manage, obviously because we're using images in this application, we're going to show you how to manage images and how to manage their display. We're going to be using stack views and constraints in order to control how the images lay out on the user UI, on the user interface, both in portrait modes and in landscape modes. And for that, we'll use something called size classes. And finally, we'll do a little bit of coding, not very much, when we connect buttons and labels and images using outlets and actions so that the UI can display the correct image and the correct text for the corresponding information. So to start a new project, we're going to be using a single view application, and we're going to name the project Project Mongoose. Of course, it's going to be a Swift application, and we're going to be adding an image, a view, a label, and 3 buttons. We're going to launch Xcode, and then we're going to open up a new Xcode project. We're going to do a single view application. We're going to name it Project Mongoose. It's a Swift application, and we're going to go ahead. We don't need any of these. We're going to go ahead and create the file, and I have a folder called Mongoose that I'm going to put it in, and I just hit create, and the project is launched. There's nothing for us to do here. Let's go and take a look at the storyboard. We're going to take a look at the view controller layout, and let's make this a little bit bigger. And the first thing we want to add would be the button. So we go into the lower right corner and do a search for buttons, and there we have the button. And I need to select the view controller, and now I just simply drag the button over to here. And since I'll need 3 buttons, I can just duplicate them. Before I duplicate them, I might want to get them about the right size, centered, and maybe increase the size of the font. Let's make it 20. And to duplicate it, all I do is hit Command D twice to get two additional copies of the button. Lay them out approximately like this. And we've got our 3 buttons. We then want to get the label. So we just do a search for label. There's the label. And again, we want to resize that. We'll size the label all the way across. And we'll do one other thing with the label. We'll center the text in the label. We'll increase the size of that font to 20 as well. And so now we've got a label in place, and finally we want to add an image view. So we just do a search for image, and we drag that over to here. And we've got that approximately like that. With the image view, we're going to also adjust its size by using the size inspector right here. 240 by 240 image size. So we have a nice square image. So that's basically the beginning of what we want to do. Let's do a few more tidying up. One of the things we want to do right here is set the background color of the view to a somewhat different color. So we'll just go to background color, and we'll pick this orangey color. So now we've essentially got the starting point for the user interface, and we're going to proceed from there, looking at how to constrain all these elements. We've got a total of 5 elements floating around here. We're now going to consider some of the initial setup of the UI, and we're also going to talk about constraints. Before we do that, we're going to add text to the label and to the buttons. We're then going to arrange the image, the label, and buttons in the approximate layout. And finally, we're going to use something called a pin control to reset to suggested constraints. Xcode gives you a way of suggesting a set of constraints, and we'll take a look at what that does for you. So the way you get to suggested constraints is you go to the little pin item that's right there, and you click on that, and you select the option called Reset to Suggested Constraints. If you do that, you'll find that your layout gets moved around, and a lot of blue lines appear. Blue lines indicate that these are consistent constraints. So you can see there's the separation of the image view from the left edge is specified. The separation of the label from the image is specified. The separation of each of the buttons from each other is specified. So there are actually a lot of specifications that the system comes up with for you. But as you'll see, once we do this, it's not necessarily going to be something that will be always useful. And what we'll take a look at in more detail is all the constraints that this generates for you. And this will give you an idea of how complex doing constraints can be. And you can only imagine how much more complicated it will get if you need to take into account both portrait and landscape views, or both on iPhone format and an iPad format. So this is really not a simple matter, and we'll get into that. We're going to carry out what we just discussed. So the first thing we want to do is select the pin control. If you click it, it's at the bottom of the screen right here. If you click it, you get an option, reset to suggested constraints. And if we click on that, you will see some blue lines appear here. And if we now go back to this area where the details of all the elements in the view are listed, you will see that there are now a bunch of constraints that have been added. I'm just fleshing them out for you so you can see exactly what they are. And so you can see how many constraints have in fact been added to the list. And in fact, you can also look at individual constraints. If we click on this one, for example, you can see the constraints on the image view. The center of it is also aligned with the center of the label. And if you click on this constraint, that's the constraint over here, and that's the image leading view distance, and it's 51 points from the leading edge. So the main point I wanted to illustrate is that there are a lot of things that constrain this view. And the next thing we want to do is essentially just put labels on these various buttons, and we do that just by going to the attributes inspector, and we just essentially put in the name here. So we'll put in dog, cat, and mongoose, my favorite. Okay, so now we've updated the buttons, and we'll also update the label. We do it the same way, change the word label to unknown critter. And then as the way we'll design this is when we press the button for dog, the word dog will appear there. Nothing earth-shaking, but it will illustrate a whole bunch of things. So what we just learned is how to attach labels to the various elements. The one thing we haven't really discussed is how you attach images here. And the image we want to have here at this point is a little image that says no image because we haven't selected an image yet. And later on, when we press dog or cat or mongoose, we want a picture of one of those animals up there. And we'll talk about that next. We're going to add some images to our project. And in order to do that, we first have to find images of 3 critters and put them into a folder called animals. I've already done that, so we have a folder ready to go. We also need to include one image which will display when there is no image on display, and I found an image for that as well. And we will then select the assets folder in our project and drop the folder with images in it right on that folder, and that will then make all of those images available to our projects. And you'll see how that works. So that's basically how you add images that are built into your project. So if you have a project that has some images that you're using as part of your application, this is where you would put them. And we will, for our case, we will actually pick one of the images. We'll start with a dog, and we'll put it into the project. You add the image to the project by selecting the image view and then specifying the image you want to put in that image view. The other thing you will need to do is specify something called content mode. And content mode is is essentially specifying how the image sits in the actual frame of the image view. So in our case, our image view frame is 80 by 80. And as you can see, the dog is not a square image. You want to essentially fit it in some way. And there are several choices you have on how you put an image into an image view. We'll talk about that as well. We'll look at that. And we will then basically run the program and see how it looks. And you'll see that the portrait mode of the application now looks pretty good. We've got the image, we've got unknown critter, the text because we didn't change the image yet to no image, and we have the buttons nicely laid out. But don't forget that the constraints that were done while the view was in portrait mode. So the question is, how will it look if we flip this to landscape mode? What will happen? The best suggested constraints in the portrait mode won't work for the landscape mode. So this is where we need to really dig in a little deeper. Let me just show you how it looks without any images. So if I select the image view right here, and I take a look at the attribute inspector, there's a property here called image, which is the property of this image view. And if I look at it, there are really no options available. And we'll see how we can change that by basically adding the folder of animal images. And as you can see, I have a folder right here called animals, and it's got a bunch of animals in it. It's got a dog, a cat, a mongoose, and it also has one image that represents an image which will display that says we don't have any images. So let's put the dog in, and what we're going to do is we're going to just take this folder, take it, and drop it, and it's in there. And now, if we go back to our storyboard, and select the image view, now we can see we've got all the images available to us for the application. So if we want to put the dog in, we'll click that, and there's the dog. Now, you'll notice that the dog looks a little different because it's in a content mode called scale to fit. So whatever the size is of the dog, it just squeezes it into the 80 by 80. And this is not what we want. So if we take the cat gets stretched vertically, and the mongoose gets, doesn't get changed so much. Well, let's kind of explore what's called content mode. So one option is scale to fit, and then it just takes whatever image you have and squishes it into the frame of the image view. If we go to aspect fit, then you could see it, that really looks more like it, because now it's essentially taking the longest dimension of the image itself and squeezing that into the image frame. So you can see what's going to happen if we take the cat, which is wider than it is taller. It will then fit it in widthwise. And then if we do the mongoose, it turns out, is exactly a square image, so it fits in perfectly. So that's using aspect fit. Let's take a look at a couple of others. If we do aspect fill, well, this one doesn't seem to make any difference. How about cat? So here the cat goes beyond the image size. And that's also something we don't want. And let's see what happens to dog. And dog also goes beyond the image size. So what's an aspect fill is it takes the smallest dimension of the image and fits that into the image frame. Let's look at one other. Let's look at center. Now here, it just centers the image that it has. So it doesn't worry about, aspect. And if we take the cat, well, it turns out that our cat image is huge. So it just puts it in the center, and that's the center of the cat image is right here, and it just puts it in there. And same thing with the Mongoose. Mongoose is also a much bigger image, so it would essentially overwhelm the image view. It goes way beyond the image view. Sometimes you do want an image which is larger than the image view, so you can scroll around within the image. Okay, so there's all kinds of uses. An example is a map where the actual size of the screen is a view into a much larger image. So let's go back to our one that works best for us, which is aspect fit. And we'll go back and put the dog in there. And now we've got this all set up. Now, let's take a look at how this would actually look if we run it on the simulator. I just want to mention that the simulator we're using is an iPhone 6, and we'll execute it on that simulator, and let's see how it comes out. By the way, this is no code at all. It's just, constraints and images and so on. And that looks pretty good. The dog is nicely set up in there. The buttons are nicely spaced. The label is under there. Obviously it's not perfect, but it's approximately what we would expect. But the question really is, these constraints were done in portrait mode, and will they work if we go to a landscape mode? So let's try it. So we can flip a simulator into landscape mode by holding the Command key and the right arrow key. And if we do that, wow, the images just goes right off the screen, and all you see is dog and cat. So obviously this does not work. So we're now going to go deeper into how we can use restraints. We'll also introduce something called stacks to see how we can manage going back and forth into different views. We're going to be using stack views in order to simplify handling of the layout in both portrait and landscape views. So to do that, first thing we'll need to do is clear the existing constraints that we created automatically for the portrait view. We want to handle the buttons as a group, and to do that, we're going to put them into a stack. Stacks are essentially containers for collections of other views, such as button views. And they could be both vertical stacks and horizontal stacks. In this case, this is going to be a vertical stack, and we're also going to do the same thing for the image and label, and we'll put them into their own separate stack because we want to handle the two stack views separately when we are going to a landscape view. In the landscape view, we're going to put the image and the label over to the right. In the portrait view, it's over in the top, and the buttons over to the left of the image view. And in the portrait, it was below the image view. So that's essentially how we would use the stack views. And the power of the stack views comes from the fact that we only need to put constraints on the stack view because we've already worked out how the details of the contents of the stack are handled. So as you can see, the stack view for the buttons is the same in both portrait and landscape. So all we're doing is we're rearranging the stack. Just to show you how we create the actual stacks, we select the buttons, and then we pick the embed in stack command down here, and that creates a stack. And then we would go up to the stack view and put in some specifications. And stack view, you can see the stack view is a container now for the 3 buttons. We can do the same thing with the image and label, put them into a vertical stack, and that will create another stack view over here. And then to handle the case of the portrait and landscape, we'll need to use size classes. Size classes in the portrait orientation means we're selectively applying constraints that are only in effect while we're in portrait orientation. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially set the size class we want, which means in portrait the width is compact and the height is regular. We're going to take both stack views, the one with the image and the one with the buttons, and we'll center them along the x-axis, that's the horizontal space, and we'll constrain the image, the stack with the image, to the top of the view by 20 points, and we'll constrain the button stack to the bottom of the image stack by about 80 points. And that should give us something like this, which is what we already have in the default stacking. So we're not gaining much here. When we go to the landscape orientation, the way we get there is first we have to click over here. That then pops up a lower panel that shows you the orientation and size options. And then you select the landscape mode for the right size of the thing you're designing for. What you'll find is that the image on the UI view goes into landscape display, but the location of the 2 stacks remains where they were. Namely, it just sits there. And what you will need to do before you apply constraints on this is move them around on this new display to the approximate positions. And by doing that, you can then apply the constraints in a logical way. And we'll go through that when we actually do this. Also, you notice that selecting this size class, the width is compact and the height is compact for the iPhone 7 or 6 in landscape mode. Both stack views are now centered along the y-axis, namely in the vertical axis. You will now constrain the image stack to the right side by 20 points, and you'll constrain the button stack to the image stack by about 150 points. And that's basically it. And then by doing that, you will be essentially applying different sets of constraints for the device in portrait and landscape mode. Now I'm going to set up the various things we just discussed. So to start with, we want to get rid of the existing constraints which were generated automatically. First, we need to select the view controller, the view. And if we then come here, we'll see an option that says clear constraints for all the views. And we'll just press that quickly, and that clears all the constraints. And now we have a completely unconstrained view of our project. Now, the first thing we do want to do is put in one constraint, which is a constraint for the image view. And we want to make sure that the image view, both a width and a height, that's at 240. Now, we had previously set that, but we want to make sure that holds as a constraint. So we'll put that in as 2 constraints. And now we've added constraints for the height and width. That will maintain that structure. Next, we want to put the 3 buttons into a stack, and we just select all 3. Remember, you can select by holding the Shift key and clicking on each of the buttons. And down here, there's an embed in stack button. If we click on that, it will put all 3 items in a stack. But you notice that it more or less compacts them. And we can control exactly how these 3 buttons are laid out within the stack by going to the Attribute Inspector, Stack View, and notice that it knows it's a vertical stack. There are other options to make it a horizontal stack. If you wanted to do that, you can do that, and it would lay them out horizontally. But we really want to go with the default that it picked based on their positions as a vertical stack. We want to distribute the buttons. We have a variety of options. We want to distribute them so they're distributed with equal spacing, and we'll make the spacing 20. And if we do that, you can see we've got some layout between them. The alignment that it picked was fill, which is a nice default alignment. We could have made the alignment leading, in which case it would just align them to flush left. And there are other options here, but we'll stick with the fill option. And now we can also see that we probably want to take this stack and fatten it a little. And we can do that by applying a constraint on the stack view. And here's the stack view over here. If we select that stack view with 120, and if we do that, the stack view is not nicely sized. Next, we want to put these into a stack. And we do it the same way. We just click on a stack view. And we'll again also come here for the stack view, and we'll make the alignment a fill alignment, and we'll make the distribution equal spacing, and we'll make the spacing here 10. And that will give us a little gap between the label and the image. And so now we're ready to lay out the spacing in the portrait view. And how do we do that so it's only in effect in the portrait view? Well, there's a view as an iPhone here. We'll click that, and you can see we're selecting an iPhone 7 as the format size, and we'll select the portrait orientation. And if we want to vary the constraints that we're going to put on going forward, strictly for this view, we will say vary for traits. And we'll say it's, in this case, the trait that's unique here is the height, because the height for a landscape view is also is going to be different. It's going to be compact, and for the portrait view, it's regular. So we'll hit return on that. And then what we're going to do is now put in the constraints. So the first constraint we want to put in on the stack view is we want the stack view to be 20 points below the top, and we want the stack view to be horizontally centered. So we've added two constraints on the stack view, and you can see them right here. Okay? And now we want to do the same thing for the button stack view. And for the button stack view, we're going to add 80 points below the image view stack. So we'll add that constraint. And now you can see we've added another constraint here. And then we also want these to be horizontally constrained. So you can see with 4 constraints, we have been able to completely constrain this, and because there's nothing red here, just adjust yellow warning markers, and that's just to adjust the misplacement. And if we do that, this is pretty much the way it will look when we are constraining it in portrait mode. We then click on Done Varying It, and you can now see that we're completely in this mode. We've now laid it out in the portrait orientation. We now want to do the same thing for the landscape orientation. And the way we go to the landscape orientation is we simply click on this thing that right here, and it will change it to the landscape orientation. Now, notice that our buttons seem to have disappeared. Let's click on Stack View, and you can see basically the layout that we had in the portrait orientation put the buttons out of the view, so it didn't display it. Now, before we start applying constraints, there's some housekeeping we should do. One is that note that the stack view for the buttons has the same name as the stack view for the images. So one of the things we ought to do, image stack view and button stack view. So now you'll notice that the names here are clearly identified. And so we know exactly which controls apply to which. Notice, by the way, that all of the constraints that were in effect in the portrait mode are now disabled because we're now in the landscape orientation. So let's do some more cleaning up here. Let's move these things so that we can position them relative to each other. Now, the way they're positioned right now, if we tell the button image stack to have a certain distance to the right of the image stack, it'll be very confusing because they're one above the other. So let's first take the image stack view and move it all the way to the right by going to the size inspector and putting it in the x coordinate of 400. And that puts it over to the right. And we'll do something similar to the button stack view, and we'll move that so that it's 100 down. Sorry, I got that wrong. I don't want to do that. I want to move it to the Y position at 100. Okay? So now this is now in the approximate layout that we want to implement, and now all we have to do is put on constraints. And again, we need to vary the constraints for this particular orientation, so we press that, and we say this is going to be a variance based on height, and notice that the height for the landscape mode is wide compact and height compact. Okay? And so now we're ready to start applying the constraints. We'll start with the image stack view. And first thing we want to do here is say it's 20 points from the right side. We'll add that constraint. And we'll also say that it's now vertically in the center. Okay, and we'll do the same thing with the button stack. And here are these two constraints in the landscape mode. And the button will apply a constraint also on the right of 150 points. And we'll apply a similar constraint vertically centered. And again, we have on this little yellow warning telling us that it's not where it's constrained to be. So just clicking those will move them into the right position. So now basically we have constrained in the landscape mode, we've constrained our two stacks relative to each other, and we're done varying. So now let's go back and take a look at the constraints and see what's going on. So first of all, notice that when we're looking at it in landscape mode, there are only the landscape constraints that are active. And if we go to the portrait mode, only the portrait constraints are active. And notice something else. The constraints we applied that were independent, namely the height and width constraints on the image and the constraints on the width of the button stack, were done without consideration to orientation. And if I flip back and forth, you can see the only constraints that change or that are enabled or disabled are the ones that were done specifically when I applied the constraints per orientation, or it could be per size and so on. In other words, so this is a very general tool that allows you to apply constraints based on size and orientation and so on. So it's very powerful, and the fact that we used the stacks really simplified our work tremendously. So that's basically size, the use of size classes, and also the use of stacks. We have completed the layout of the user interface, and we're now ready to take a look at it. If we run the app, we will see both the portrait mode and the landscape mode appear as we have designed them. But if we press any of these buttons, nothing happens because we haven't coded and automated any of it. And that's going to be the next step. We're going to make both the label and the UI image properties of the UI of the controller class. The press of the button is an event that will become a function in the UI controller. So all of the programming will take place in the controller and is completely separated from the user interface. I'm going to create a custom view controller. And the main thing we need to be concerned with is that in the identity inspector on the right side, that we identify the simple view controller as the controller for this view. The label is the first thing we're going to connect to the simple view controller, and that connection is made by putting the two the UI view and the code of the simple view controller side by side, and we can simply drag and drop from the label right to the view controller, and that will create a relationship between the two. When we do the control drag, we'll get a little pop-up window, and we can then select the type of connection that it is. In our case, it'll be an outlet. Outlet means it will create a property of the simple view controller class. We'll give it a name, so that's the name of the property, and we'll give it a type, and that's the type of class that this property is. When we're done, we press the connect button, and that will create what's called an IB outlet for a variable whose name is critter name label, and it's of a type UI label. We can do the same thing for the UI image view, and when we do that, we'll have two outlets that, that link the code in the controller to the image and label in the UI. The next thing we want to do is we want to populate both the image and the label with initial values. And we will do that in the override function viewDidLoad. And it's very simple. We simply set the value of the critter name label property to select critter. In other words, we're going to put the text select critter in the label, and in the image we're going to put an image called no image. And when we do that and start the application, it will look like this. So now we've automated with code the values that appear in the label and the image that appears in the image frame. Now we want to essentially enable the buttons so that they function. And buttons create what is called an IB action. IB action is just a function that's created in the interface builder, hence IB action. And that's also done by doing a control drag from the button right to the controller class. We give it a name. We'll call it pick critter, and we give it a type of action that this is a for UI button. And then if we press the connect button, it will create a function that now can respond to the user's press of the button. And you can verify that since we did the control drag from the dog button, if you hover your mouse over the connection, then you'll see that the button for dog lights up. We could do this for all three buttons and then we'd have three functions, but we really don't want to do that. What we want to do is all three buttons to essentially be connected to a single action, and we can do that very easily. We want to select the action and then drag to the button that we want to add as a connection. And when we do that for all three, we'll essentially have a connection to all three buttons to that single action. So now we have a function that can respond to a press on the button, and that press will send a different button to that. So we need to add code to that function, and we basically add it right into the function pick critter. And just to go over the code very simply, we take the UI button property called current title and set that equal to critter, and then we use that to essentially populate the value of the text of the label, and we use that to retrieve the image for the text. And if we do that correctly, we will get something that looks like this when we press the dog button. And similarly, whatever button we press, that button will send its own current label. And you'll notice that we cleverly named the buttons the same as the image names of the various animals. So this way, pressing the button automatically retrieves the correct image. Now, we may want to add a frame to the image, and in this example of code that we have here, we will add a round frame when the image itself is square. And this is illustrated here. That's basically it. Let's actually do the coding now and see how it plays out. We have now completed all of the layout of the user interface, And the next step is really just to test it out. So we can either hit this button or we can hit Command R, but we'll just run it. And if we run it, we get the portrait view of the application. You'll notice, of course, that none of the buttons work because we haven't done any coding behind those buttons, and that basically it just shows you exactly what is the default settings in the user interface. But if we hold the Command key and the right arrow key, uh, we can look at it in portrait mode, and as you can see, it's exactly laid out the way we had designed, which is to say correctly. Our user interface laid out and finalized, we can begin to do the coding. The view controller is a file that's right here, and if I click on it, I can see it. And as you can see, it's a very simple class. It's of a type UIViewController, and it's only got two functions in it. We're going to use this class to control the UI view. And if we go back to the main storyboard, we will essentially link uh, this storyboard to the UI view controller class. And we're going to do that by going to this little sort of two circles. It's called the assistant editor. If we click on that, we will see the storyboard side by side with the view controller class. And what we want to do here is connect the elements in um, this view to the controller class. So we do that by selecting one of the elements. We'll start with the label that will appear under the image. We hold the control key and we drag over to the view controller class, and then we let go. And when we do that, we get a little pop-up screen, and it will give us a connection between the UI view and this class. There are several different types of connections. We'll select an outlet. We'll give it a name, and the name will be critter name label. Now, I generally like to give it a very full name, and also I like to identify the type of um, name that it is. In other words, it's a label. It's a name for a label. Under type, we're identifying the class of this item. This is a UI label element. It's a class. And then when we select connect, what it does is it actually creates a property of the view controller right inside the view controller. It's, as you can see, it's got the prefix at IB outlet. This really is a reminder that this property, this variable critter name, which is of a UI label class type, was created in the interface builder as an outlet. What this gives us is access to this class in the user interface. There's a very handy little button down here that will give you access to the specific items. So if you have things embedded in stack views, sometimes they're difficult to access. So you can simply go to this, select it over here, and you can see that selects it here. And then we can either control drag from here or from here. Sometimes I like to do this. And then if you control drag from the element itself and let go, you'll again get another pop-up with an outlet. We'll call this the critter image. That's easy enough. And if we connect that, you can now see we have two outlets. To clean up the display here a little bit, let's hide the leftmost window by clicking this button and move this around a little bit. And just to show you that the connections exist, you can hover your mouse over this and you can see that the critter name label lights up, and if you hover over this, the critter image with the name of the property appearing right there over it. So we've established two links. There's another place where you can see what these links are about. There's a button over here, which if you click it, you can actually see that the critter image is now a reference outlet in the view controller. In other words, it's a property in the view controller. And if you click on this, you'll see the critter name label is also a reference outlet in the view controller. Now we have access to the values inside the label and the image view. So let's load them up when we start the view controller. There's a function in the view controller class that's called viewDidLoad, which essentially is invoked when the view is loaded up. So it's very convenient for us to essentially populate the values, the initial values of the label. So for example, our label is critter name label is the instance of this label class that's in this view. So we just type in critter name label, and then we select the text property of the label class, and we set that equal to select critter. So now when we first start this, the word select critter will appear there. The words unknown critter were created when we defined the label, but this is when it loads up the view. And we can do something very similar with the image. The image instance of the image class is called critter image. So we just type in critter image. And the critter image property we're interested in is the image property. And we're going to set that to a UI image view. And we will call that up from our asset, from our folder, using UI image by typing in named and then the name of the image. And you remember one of the images we have is no image. So now we have essentially finished the initialization of the view controller. And we can test this by running the application and to see how it looks. And what we're expecting is we're expecting the label to be initialized and the image to be initialized. And there it is. And you can see that the words select critter appear where it used to be unknown critter, and now instead of having a nice cat, we have sorry, no image available. And we're really being prompted to select the critter. But of course, if we select any of these critters, nothing happens. So we need to do the next bit of coding, which is we need to connect the buttons to these three buttons to this view controller. And we really follow it in a very similar way. We can simply select the button that's labeled dog, and we can control and drag that over here and drop it. And now we'll again get the pop-up. We now select an action, because what this will do is it will create a function when you press it. And we'll give this a name, select, or let's say pick critter button, and we'll make sure it's a type UI button, and then we'll connect it. And what we get here is a function. It's also got a prefix of IB action because it's a function that's been created in the interface builder. And we're going to put all of our coding in here, right inside this function, and we will essentially be responding to the fact that the UI button will have been pressed. Now, we already know that the UI button has a property which is the label of the button, so we theoretically will want to be able to uh, use the same function for any one of these three buttons. But right now, if we hover over here, we'll see that the only button connected is dog. So the challenge is, how do we connect the other two buttons to this function? And that's really very, very simple. We simply take this and drag it over here and drop it, and now it's connected. Drag it and drop it over here, and now we have all three buttons connected to the single function. So no matter which button you hit, this function will be activated. So now we want to put our code in here. First thing we want to do is we want to define a property within this function. So we'll say let critter equal the sender dot current title. Let me explain this a little bit. Sender is the UI button. When we press any one of these buttons, we're activating this function, and the function is sending the specific button we pressed. So when we press dog, the current title will be dog, and we'll take that text and store it in a property called critter. Now that we have saved the text that appears in the button in a property of this function called critter, we can use that to update the actual label, which, as you remember, is called critter name label. So we just type critter name label, we select that, and we take the text property of the label class, and we set that equal to the property critter, which itself is a text. And that basically is how we update the label. Now when we press the button, the current title of the button is stored in the property critter, and then we use that property to update the label itself. And we can do something quite similar with the text to essentially pull up the image of the specific critter. So we'll create another property called let critter photo be a UI image type. In other words, we're creating another property called critter photo, which is an image. And we'll just set that equal to UI image. And as we did before, we'll essentially retrieve an image which has an identification, and we'll use the critter name for that identification. So that gives us a copy of the image, and now all we need to do is update the actual image view. And the image view, as you recall, is right up here. It's called critter image. So we'll say critter image, and we'll take the image property of the critter image, and we'll set that equal to critter photo. Focus on a particular part of the screen that is a problem. First, I want to point out that we have this little tag here. When you hit this area of the screen, uh, you can light it up like that. And the problem is that what this does is it will pause the running of the code at that point. We don't really want to do that, so we got rid of that, and we just grab it and drag it. So if we want to bring it back, we just click it, and when we want to get rid of it, we just move it away. The other problem we have is this little red dot here, which is telling us there's something wrong here. Uh, the problem that this is calling to our attention is the fact that the UI image that we set the critter photo to is an optional. It's not just an image. And therefore, we would need to unpack this. But we don't really need to be that sophisticated here, especially when you're new to this. You can just click on this and you'll get a little message here that will actually give you a way to fix it. And it will tell you right here, value of optional type, string not unwrapped. Did you mean to use this or that? And if you click on the blue area that says fix it, it fixes it. And now you're all done and you can proceed with your coding. So now we can just simply run that code. And if we click on dog, it updates the label, updates the image. If we click on cat, it updates the label and cat. And if we click on mongoose, it updates those. So we have come full circle, and we have learned quite a bit about different different properties. And we can also see that when we hit command and flip it over on its side, it all works just fine, regardless of which way we have it. So this just about completes what we wanted to do in Project Mongoose. There's one more thing which I'd like to add, and notice that Mongoose is a square image and cat and dog are either landscape or portrait images. So when we have a square image, what we'd like to do is put a border around the image. And so let's take a look at how we do that. That should be fairly straightforward. We're going to add a little bit of code into the pick critter button function, which will add a circular border to images that are square. I've just cut and paste the code that we'll be using, and you can look at it in detail yourself. But before getting into the code, I need to explain two important things. One, the image that we display is in something called a UIViewController, which itself is square. And that is a class that's a subclass of UIView. And what we put into that UI image is a photo, which itself is a UI image class. In other words, critter photo, the property we create, is a UI image class, and it's a photo, and the critter image is essentially a UI image view into which we'll put the photo. So if you understand the difference between these two, we can proceed. So first thing we look at is the critter photo. In other words, we want to know if the photo itself is square. And so we check the size of the photo. We look at the size property of the UI image class, and it has a size property and a width property, and we compare it to the size height property, and if they're identical, we will then say it's a square image, and we can go ahead and apply our border foot to that. And the way we do that is we make use of a property of the UI image view called layer, and a layer has something called a corner radius. And the corner radius in a square is the way you round off the corners. But if you make the corner radius equal to half the width of the frame of the UI view, then in fact what you're going to get is an exact circle. So having a larger corner radius uh, that is exact match to the corner width, having a corner radius that is equal to 1/2 the width will result in a circle. We then apply another property called masks to bound. In other words, we want to hide everything that's outside of the bounds of the layer. And by setting this property to true, then we're basically suppressing anything outside of, um, of the radius. And then finally, we can have a border width. We can set that to 3 points, and we can also set a border color. And if we do these things, we'll create a black, uh, border that is an exact circle. And the image, the square image, will be inside of that. And of course, if it's not a square, then we're going to turn off the masks to bound, and we won't have any border width. And that will be the result we'll see with a square image. So that's basically the code that will accomplish that. And the only thing we need to do is now run the code and see how it looks. Let's try the code. So we just press the run button here, and build has succeeded as we expect. And here we go. We have the initial screen. If we press dog, we see a dog. If we press cat, we see a cat. If we press mongoose, voila, we see the mongoose in a nice circular frame. And if we hold Command key and hit the right arrow key, we'll flip it on its side. And that is basically the Mongoose project in all its glory, and I hope you've learned a lot in the process in this very, very simple application. Thank you very much.